Holt Miniature Painting and Seedy Tea Publishing presents a step-by-step tutorial on painting a three-wheel tank called the Badger. Here I am showing the parts that assemble the Badger. I'm going to be using the artwork to construct two different variants of the tank. The red one on the front with the machine gun, and the green olive green one on the back. Here's all the parts. I'll be using a needle file, a pin vise for pinning, a hobby knife, and some super glue. Clean your model of all mold lines and imperfections of the molding process with a needle file or a hobby knife, just scraping off any areas that need treatment. I'm going through each part and making sure it's all cleaned up and ready for assembly. Take your time. Make sure that you got it all cleaned up and ready for assembly. Using the hobby knife to carve out any extra parts added from the molding process, and just cleaning off the mold lines, just gently scraping away. Here I am using a toothbrush to help wipe away any of the resin dust. Like I said, just take your time in this process. Make sure everything's cleaned up and ready for assembly. Overall, the models are really nicely made. There wasn't a whole lot of mold lines that I had to deal with. With the small parts, just be very careful you don't drop them and lose them. Now here's all the parts ready for assembly. Here I am going to pin the wheels to the front end. I use a thumbtack to place a divot, so I can line up with the pin vise, which is a small little drill that will add more stability for the assembly of the wheels. So just line up with the divot that I use with the thumbtack and just slowly drill into the material. When you get it to what depth you want, just rotate the drill back to bring it back out. Now I'm doing the other side. I'm measuring how far in I drilled. So I push the pin vise into it and hold it with my thumb to see the depth. And that's about the right depth for pinning. Now I'm doing the other side, doing the same process, checking the depth. Holding my thumb up to it. Sometimes the parts get a little stuck, but just take your time. Be careful not to break the pin. Here I am doing the same on the wheels. I find this trick very helpful when doing the pinning process. Just line it up, and you just turn the drill, the hand drill, and it just drills into it. You can, there are like a Dremel hand drills that you could use to speed up the process, but I find that heats up the parts and you take the chance of breaking the drill or drilling too far in. Here I'm applying just some thin wire, checking to make sure the depth is fine, adding some super glue. Holding it in there and it seals right away. And I'm taking a pair of clippers and just cutting the pin to the desired length I want. Sometimes I might have to cut the pin a little bit shorter or drill a little bit more to make sure I have a nice clean fit. Making sure it's all lined up. Add my super glue. Put the two parts together. I hold for a few seconds, lining it up. And there we go, we have a wheel. Now we'll do the same on the other side. I always like to dry fit the parts before I add glue, just to make sure that it lines up correctly and I know exactly the placement of the parts. Now we have the wheels on. Now we're going to use a larger drill bit and drill out part of the cannon here. On both ends. Just lining it up in the center. You can use the thumbtack to make a pivot hole. This drill bit is quite large and I don't have a vise to hold it, so I'm just drilling it with my hand. Just enough to give it an impression of a hole in the cannon. Dry fitting it onto the tank and rearranging it to see, positioning it how I want it. I kind of wanted it sideways, give it a little more dimension. Here I'm using a hobby knife to score a few lines into the resin, and this gives the super glue more to grip onto. And it's a large enough space that I don't need to pin the cannon onto there. Just add some glue. You don't want, too much. You don't want it when you push the two parts together that there's excess glue coming out of the ends, out of the sides. I have a few seconds to reposition it, hold it tight, and there we go. It's looking good. Now we'll just add on the front headlight bit that comes with it. These are optional parts. You don't need to add them onto it, but I thought it was really cool. And then in the back, there's a small little spot that you can put the back light. It's a very small piece, so be careful that you don't lose it. I'm using the hobby knife to adjust it and make sure it gets into position where I want it. Alright, and there we go. Here I'm adding some glue to the front bumper. Lining it up. Make sure it's centered. This is a great addition to the tank. Pushes everything out of its way. So it's cruising through. And now I'm attaching the gas tank or oil tank on the back. Now we have the completed model, and it looks just like the artwork. I went ahead and assembled the second tank using the same procedure, just replacing the missile launcher with the Gatling gun. Now we are going to use some two-part epoxy to fill in any holes and imperfections from the resin casting. These are little air bubbles that do happen during the casting process, but they're easily defits. Little pot holes and things like that. You're going to be using a two-part epoxy putty. It's a blue and yellow strips. You mix them together. They make the color green. That way you know they are properly mixed together. This is also known as green stuff. I'm using Carmet's lip balm as a smoothing agent. Any chapstick will work, or I find it's easier to use the chapstick than water. Some sculpting tools, some rubber tip sculptors. I just pull off equal size of both colors off the ribbon. And then just knead it together with your fingers like you would with bread or molding clay. When I mix the two halves together, you'll know they are properly mixed together when you have a nice solid green color, hence the name green stuff. I just attach it to my thumbnail, add some lubricant Carmet's onto my thumb. It's easy to have it right there when I'm doing this process. So all you do is just take a little bits of the putty and push it into the hole. And then just I add the Carmet's to it to make the help with the tools to be more to smooth out the putty and things like that. Scrape off the excess, smooth it out, that easy. Here I'm just going around the model, transferring between the sculpting tool, the metal sculpting tool, and the rubber tip shapers. Clay shapers is what they call them. Real simple technique. It does take a while to get used to working with the medium, but once you get the hang of it, it's real quick and easy. I find this works a little bit better than you can add super glue into the holes, but that can end up being a mess if you have too much super glue on there or anything like that. I just find this easier, especially with the clay shapers. The rubber tips, it helps smooth it out. And the reason why you get these is you get little air bubbles get trapped in the process. So now I'm going to show you how I sculpted this little duffel bag added onto it. So I just roll out a good piece of the green stuff, very thin, and just roll it like you do a sleeping bag. It's very simple, very easy to do. Nice rolled bag, and I just press it on to the area I want it. And then I just use my clay shapers and sculpting tool and just press it on there and push it in and sculpt it onto it. The majority of it's already done from rolling it up. All I'm doing is just attaching it and make sure it's on there nice and secured. Now we're going to use some small pieces of green stuff and making straps. So you just roll it out and just gently add it onto the area, pressing down with my fingers using the sculpting tools. Make sure it's secured. These little bits definitely help the model look really cool. So now it's the second strap I'm attaching. Just taking my time, making sure it's nice and smooth. Here I'm using a pointer tool to add some belt buckles. You can use a hobby knife, a dull hobby knife. Just use a file to smooth down the edge of the hobby knife so it's dull, so you don't actually cut yourself. But these little tools do help. You can also just use a piece of wire and attach it to a wooden dowel for a tool. It's very quick and easy. Just readjusting and smoothing out the areas. Making sure you have the indentation of the strap so you can see the difference. And there's the finished bag. And the tanks are all ready for cleaning and priming. Before I prime my models, I like to give it a little bath, basically, just using an old toothbrush and some warm soapy water. I use dish soap, dish liquid, not hand soap, because hand soap have lotions. And basically what I'm doing is I'm washing off the chapstick lubricant on the green stuff, and cleaning off any oils that are on the model. Here I'm using just a squirt bottle to rinse off the bubbles off the soap and everything. So by doing this before I prime, I make sure that the model is clean and ready for primer, because if there's any oils or anything on there from your fingers or from if you do any sculpting, the paint will have a better chance of it adhering to the model. So here I'm just doing the other tank real quick and easy, rinsing off the soap. Make sure I get all the soap off, and then I just let it dry on a paper towel. I leave it to dry for about at least 12 hours just to make sure it's fully dry, and that also helps. And you want to do this after your green stuff is fully cured, which I give about a day. So now these are all ready for priming. It's looking really good. All clean and ready to go. Here I'm going to prime with my airbrush. This is a Badger Patriot 105. You can use a spray rattle can, but I like to use an airbrush. That way I can have nice thin coat. Here I'm just adding a bit of Vallejo Flow Improver, just a little bit at the bottom of the cup. Here the primer I use is Badger Steinlerez. This is black primer. They have multiple colors. I like to start with a black primer on all my models. It gives me instant shadows and everything. So just a little bit in there, using an old brush to mix up the primer and the flow improver. And the flow improver just helps the paint flow through the airbrush easier. You can use the Steinler-Rez straight out of the bottle, but I like to add some flow improver just to help make sure that the tip of the needle doesn't dry. I don't get tip dry, what they call it. And just small bursts of paint on the area. I'm just wearing a latex-free rubber glove to make sure I don't get paint on my hands. So you want a nice thin coating of the primer all over. You don't need to spray heavily onto the model. That way, and otherwise if you spray it on heavy enough, you might obscure any details. You just need a nice thin layer, just enough to give it tooth so the paint can adhere to it. And I do like the airbrush for priming. That way I can move the model around and get into any nooks and crannies it may have. Here I just have them sitting on the paper towel and getting the wheels where I was holding it. This is the models, usually I put models on a paint handle where it's like a medicine container or piece of wood. But I wanted to be able to reach underneath the tank. Normally models have bases and I use those to hold on to, but these do not, so it's a little tricky, but you can work around it. Here I'm just making sure I have all the areas I wanted covered with the primer. Alright, now, and I let the primer set overnight, a good 12 hours to make sure it's fully cured. And we're going to start painting. We'll paint the red one like the front and this one like the back with the green. Doing all our base coats with the Badger Patriot. This has a 0.3 needle. We're going to be using ProAcryl paints from Monument Hobbies and Creature Caster. They work great through the airbrush and also brush. Here I just add some flow improver from Vallejo. And the color, the base coat I'm going to do over the black is called Black Brown. It's a nice dark brown. Just a few drops in there with the flow improver. Using my mixing brush, stirring it up. And just spraying it onto a paper towel to make sure it's coming out nice. And same thing like you do with your primer, just gently apply the paint, nice thin layers, making sure I'm keeping the black primer and the dark recesses, so I'm just getting the higher areas on both tanks. So the black brown is a nice base coat to work from with the olive green color that I'm going to use, and also the burnt red, or dark red I should say. Same thing, you don't want to press too hard on the brush, on the nozzle. Not the nozzle, I'm sorry, on the trigger. Here I have more control where I'm applying the paint. And this color I'm using is dark camo green from ProAcryl. And then I add camo green into it and hitting the raised areas. So the same idea that I'm using the airbrush like I would use with a regular brush is going from a dark color up to a lighter color and just hitting more towards the edges, building that dark to light color. But here it's much quicker with the airbrush. You can see with the finger I'm pressing down for the air and then gently pulling back for the paint to come out. And with the number 3 needle, the super detailed needle, I can get right in there and build up those highlights. Here I'm going to be adding some pale yellow to the camo green. And this will be my final highlight. And you can see the difference there. It's very bright. And this is just for the extreme highlights. And then I'll be using a transparent color to glaze or filter down the paint. So with the super fine detail, I get right in there and just gently pull back on the trigger to get the paint out, and I get those really nice fine lines. This takes practice, just like with anything. You know, don't be afraid if you mess up. What's great about painting is if you mess up, you can just paint over it, let it dry and paint over it and try again. And here I'm just showing just the fine lines that you can do. And all I'm doing is just slowly pulling back on the trigger to let the paint out. So I'm getting those fine, super highlights on the panels. The best way to learn control is when you get an airbrush is, you know, pick up a coloring book and just spray paint into the coloring book in the areas and staying in the lines. It's a good trick to practice. Or sit there and spray it on a, you know, any type of piece of paper and writing your name or writing your letters. So here, just still building up that color. Now I've made a mixture of green and brown transparents from ProAcryl and thinned it way down with Flow Improver. And you can see the difference between the two, where it makes it a little darker from that harsh highlight, but you still see the highlight through it. That's why you want the paint to be nice and thin. So just working around the model. To get a nice even coating. Sorry, I'm off the camera here. I had to get really close on the model. There we go. Now that's an all over. So now I'm going to take some just transparent brown, mix that up with a lot of Flow Improver. And what I mean by a lot is about roughly, you know, start out 2 to 1, 2 Flow Improver to 1 transparent, and then slowly add more and test it out. There I'm showing on my arm how thin it is. You can still see my skin through it, but it has that almost like a suntan look to it here. Now this part I'm getting really close and just spraying the brown in the recesses to give it that shadow, to give it some shadow. So just on the lower edges of the plating, underneath the gas tank, underneath the turret, around the wheel, just to give it some depth so it's not just one color. So here you can see just a little bit of that shading adds so much to the model. Now I'm going to be working on the other model. Start with the base coat of mahogany, which is a nice dark reddish brown color. And just base coating over the other tank with this. This is a great base coat to work from to get that red that I'm looking for. I'm not looking for a bright red. I'm looking for more of a muted color because it's out in the elements. Here is the burnt red, my Nets color. So doing the same thing where I'm just applying it on the plating, making sure I leave the mahogany in the recesses and the lower portions of the plates. Now I'm adding some burnt orange. It's a nice orange brown color. Roughly about a 1-to-1 mix. Just mixing it up with some more flow improver and my airbrush. Here I'm just showing the difference between the two, what the highlight color will look like. And doing the same thing, just applying it on the plating, but closer to the raised portions, the higher parts of the plates. Leaving those previous colors below it. So when you're building up your highlights, it's like building up a pyramid. You start with your base coat as the base, and then slowly and gradually building, adding color and smaller areas more towards the tip. So I get that nice dark red color. And adding the burnt orange, was a nice orangish brown, it doesn't get so bright. Here I'm adding some tan flesh into the mix. And you're probably wondering, why am I adding flesh to a red? Well, adding this pinkish tone, it does look a bit salmon, but like I did with the green tank and using the transparents to filter or glaze, I'm going to do the same here, but with a red and a brown. But I need those bright highlights to show through. So instead of adding white, which will actually make it look quite pastel and pinkish, using a flesh tone gives me this kind of a salmon looking color, but I'm using the transparents to glaze back in the red, and it'll look nice and rich. So here's the transparent red. Adding it into the pot, adding some transparent brown because the red is very pigment rich and very bright and vibrant, but I still don't want that vibrance. I want the vibrancy of the red, but not like candy apple red. So I'm using some brown to bring it back down to the same color. As you can see here on my glove, applying this filter, you can still see the highlight, but it's not so vibrant, and it dulls it down. Same here, it's roughly 1-to-1 transparent paints to 4 or 5 flow improver. Very thin, and just gently spraying it over it and building up this color. I spray it, let it dry, and then I add another coat. So I'm slowly building back this rich red. can see the difference from the front to the back. And then as I slowly spray on the transparent, that it starts to show that red, bringing that red color back. From one side to the other, the difference. The transparent paints are just fantastic for this. Very similar to glazes. You know, you might see pre-made glazes from miniature lines. What I like about the transparents is it's acrylic, so it dries and a nice matte finish. You don't get that glossy shine that normal washes or glazes do. And all I'm thinning it through the airbrush is flow improver, which is basically water with a little bit of medium, or additive I should say. So now we have that nice rich dark red back, but you can see the highlights through it. Here I'm going to add some blue, transparent blue into the mix with some more brown just to darken it up. And this will give me a nice deep purple color. Not quite black, but close to it. And here I'm spraying in the very deep recesses to give it more contrast. And still using that fine detail brush, detail needle for the airbrush. I could get right in there in between each panel and do just thin lines. Gives me some nice contrast to the plating. And I use this to kind of base coat some of the other areas. I'm using this same color on the green one, on the green tank. Just getting into those deep recesses, in between each panel. Nice violet color, not quite purple. Purple is more of a reddish, but this has more blue in it. See the difference here, adding that extra shading. An airbrush is not a be-all end-all to painting. It's a nice addition to your toolbox. And just like with anything, it takes time and practice. You can do all this with a brush too, so don't feel like you need to have an airbrush to do all that. So now I'm going to seal what I've already done using some Liquitex matte varnish, and this you can spray through your airbrush too. I just thin it with the flow improver. The matte varnish looks very creamy and white, but it sprays on nice and clear. This is basically like a safe spot that I'm doing with the varnish to protect what I've just done. That way, if I have any accidents and I totally mess up, I can easily fix them by wiping off that layer of paint without damaging what I've already done. Here I'm just thoroughly cleaning. Whenever using varnishes through your airbrush, just thoroughly clean your airbrush. So I just add some water. I pour out any varnish or paint that I'm using, adding water, using my scrubby brush to clean out the inside, flushing out, making sure it's nice and clean. And I let the varnish thoroughly dry. So now, after that varnish is dried for a good 12 hours or a day, I'm going to start adding more, do all the detail work. So it's looking really close to the artwork, which I'm very pleased with what I've done so far with the airbrush. So now we're going to start with actual paintbrushing. So here we have the red Badger tank. It's looking really good. There are some spots that I kind of oversprayed with the airbrush, but I can fix that up. So we're using the artwork as our guide. Start highlighting with some bold pyro red and some shadow flesh, which is a nice dark skin tone. Applying it onto our wet palette. So here I'm showing the mitts between the bold pyro red and the shadow flesh. It gives me a nice reddish orange color. So just using the brush, the edge of the brush, to add some highlights. Get those nice crisp lines on the edges. You want a nice fine point on your brush. I'm using a Winsor & Newton Series 7 round, number 1. It's not the miniature line, it's the round, it's the normal size. So take your time going around each end. So once I've got all the highlights on, I'm going to add some battle damage. So I'm just using a bit of foam from a tray. You also get these pieces sometimes in models. Using some black brown. And I rip up the foam to give it kind of like an irregular form and just dab it into the paint, wipe off the majority of it, and just tap it in onto the model. And because of the texture of the sponge, that gives me a nice kind of like a scatter look. And here I'm going to be using dark golden brown, which is a nice yellowish brown tone. So here it's just starting the battle damage and also dust and dirt that's collected onto the tank. Same idea. Here I'm just lightly pressing it. It's a sponging technique. You want to keep it concentrated near the edges of the panels or where you think more chipping, the paint chipping would show. Here at this point I'm going to base coat all the other areas like the tires and the metal areas with coal black. It's a dark black color. Black. So just all the panels that are going to be silver, the gun. I also started the base coat on the satchel or blanket with that black brown color. the venting on the back portion of the tank. And just getting all areas that look to be metal. This helps give me an idea and separates it from the red armor. Just take your time and be careful around what you already done. Now here we're going to add some silver. This is dark silver. Add a little bit of water to it. And here we're going to do kind of a stippling dry brush technique. Basically what it is you take your brush, dip it into the paint, wipe the majority off on your paper towel. And here I'm just brushing moving the brush across the area really quick. There's still some paint residue in your brush, and that'll pick up on the raised areas that you're brushing. I'm also just dabbing it. I'm just going to town, giving it that weathered, bent, damaged area. These have been out, these aren't well maintained areas, so you want to use an old brush for this, because as you can see, you can quickly damage your good ones. So here I'm using a nice brush and just adding some quick little highlights, painting in the belt buckle, on the satchel. Now I'm applying the highlights to the pouch using some of that dark golden brown. This is yellow ochre. It's a nice yellowish brown tone. Mixing it to the dark golden brown. Rotate my brush to get a nice fine tip. And here I'm just adding lines to give it some texture and some fabric. Painting the raised areas and the edges. Adding more yellow ochre to the mitts. Now I'm going to paint the straps, starting with the base coat, highlight color of the light umber. My base coat was the black brown. So here I'm just adding little dashes and lines with the light umber, just to make it look like worn leather. A good brush with a nice tip point works really well on this. So just slowly building up that highlight. Now here I'm going to paint the belt buckle with silver, the dark silver. Now to shade these areas, I'm going to use the transparent brown, which is a nice dark brown, reddish brown. Adding my water to it to make it nice and thin. So it's roughly about 4 or 5 parts water to the transparent brown. So as you can see, it's very nice and thin. And just glazing, pulling the glaze down to the bottom of the satchel. And over the area, but I'm concentrating more towards the bottom. So giving this nice glaze over the whole area adds to the weathered leather appearance. I'm also using this to paint in the lower areas of the metal. Gives it a nice rusted look, adding the to the shadows. On the oil tank. I'm not being neat about it. I'm just kind of also doing that stippling sponge type technique over it. And also adding it to the lower portion and undercarriage of the tank. Give it that nice weathered look, beat up look. Keeping it thin, just dabbing it all over. And just the lower portion of the plating. A lot of the painting process is back and forth. You build up the highlights, and then you go back and add more shadows, and then you can add more highlights or shadows. It's looking good so far. We'll let that fully dry. And with these, it doesn't take too long to dry. So now we're going to add some rust effects to all the silver. And on my palette, I have the colors Burnt Orange and Orange from ProAcryl paints. And this technique, what I'm going to use is a brush that I cut the tip off, so it's got a small bit of bristles. And the same idea as a dry brushing, but this I'm using it as a stippling, where I have very little paint on the brush and just dabbing it in random areas on the model. And this gives me great texture. And it looks like it looks like rust. And just building it up in the areas, getting kind of vigorous here, getting it all over. Once again, you want to use an old brush because you will damage your brush. But just getting it all over where I think rust will be. Google search is your friend in this, so you can look up like old cars and rust effects. Here I'm using the orange, which is very bright. I didn't clean my brush, so I still have some of that burnt orange in the bristles, so it gives it a kind of a mix, but just adding some of that orange. And here I'm a little more precise of where I'm adding this color, more to the raised portions where light's going to catch it. Also on the tank and on the edges where I did those initial brown stippling with the foam up in the front. Yeah, these tanks have been through a lot. They're all beat up. So just slowly building up the weathering and the rust. Now we're going to add some silver, doing the same idea with the stippling brush. I make sure it's nice and clean. It doesn't have any of that orange in it. So this is my bright silver, and I'm going to be applying this to all the metal areas. So this is where like rust has been chipped off and it's showing some of the silver underneath. So I wipe off practically all the silver. There's like barely any left on the brush. There's still some of that residue, and so just gently tapping in certain random areas. Not going too crazy with it, but just hitting some areas just to show that there's some paint. Some of the rust is chipped off. Weathering effects on your vehicles is so much fun to do. Is you want to start and paint up your model to look really nice, and before you add all the weathering techniques, so you make it all look all nice, pristine, like it just came off the factory floor, and then you dirty it up and just chip it all away. Adding some to the front portion of it. So here it really starts to show and looks really cool. And it's just a few little techniques that you do. It's very simple. It gives you fantastic results. Here on the back of the gas tank reserve. So just slowly take your time going around, just dabbing it here and there, random areas. You want to keep it more towards the edges where you think that, that chipping will occur. And here we are at this position, at this point, looking thoroughly beat up. So now I'm going to add some more shading using Citadel shades, Address Earthshade and Athonian Camel Shade, which is a olive drab tone. And this just adds more to it. And here I'm going to mix the two together, roughly 1:1. And just doing the same thing. Some of the brushing of the rust and the metal, you might lose some of your shading. So I'm just going back with these shades and adding some more color to it. The green adds to the orange. Just gives it a nice variety of color. Don't feel like you need to paint everything a brown when you're doing your shading. Add color to it. It adds more variety and it looks more realistic, I find. So here I'm just dabbing it on in areas, concentrating more in the shadows. Using my finger to kind of blend it out a bit. Got on areas that I didn't want. It's still wet. I can easily wipe it off with my finger. Here I'm going to take another brush, slightly damp, and smooth out the edges. So just dabbing it all over, mainly in the shadows and the deep creases and crevices of the oil tank here down in the grating. Taking a clean brush, slightly wet, and just kind of blending out that edge so I don't have a harsh line. It's still wet, so what I'm doing with the second brush is it's slightly damp, and I just apply it at the edge of the paint and just move it out away from the shadow to smooth out the edge. And here we are at this point. It's looking really good. Getting really close to the artwork. I'm very pleased with it. Have the weathering. So now we're going to add more highlights to the satchel. So I'm going to be using a color I made, a dark khaki, which is a 1:1 mix of light umber and golden brown from ProAcryl. Put this on my palette. Thin it a little bit with some water. Get a nice point on my brush. I want to make really nice fine lines here. So from the transparent wash, the glaze, it's darkening up a bit, so we're just bringing back the highlights to the raised areas to give it that nice transition from light to dark. So very thin lines, dabbing it on there to give it some texture. Keeping those brighter highlights up to the top. And we're going to add more highlights to the straps, the leather straps with the leather brown, the light umber, I mean. Add a little bit of that dark khaki in there. So like I said, just going back and forth. Because I added the shading, it darkened it a bit. So I just want to add some more highlights just to help make it pop. Keeping it more towards the uppermost portion of the bag. Alright, so now we're going to concentrate some more weathering and dirt back on the lower portion of the tank. So I'm mixing these two, the light umber and the dark khaki, using my stippling brush and just concentrating more on the edges, just to highlight up the dirt and grime on the undercarriage. So just dabbing it on the edge, giving it that texture. Really adds to the effect of that it's been driving in a desert wasteland. So rotating your model around, looking at all the angles to see where it needs attention is a great way. Adding here onto the front portion of it. And even just going over where I added the silver and stuff, it just adds layer upon layer, and it looks more naturalistic, like the paint's been chipped and from the tank driving through the valley and the wasteland, it's getting all that dirt and grime coming up and covering over it. Here I'm just using some more dark khaki and just lightly applying it more towards the edge, just as a highlight. Just lightly dabbing it on there. So it gives it a lot of just splotchiness, and it looks like mud and splattering up on it. This is a great technique on the bottom of cloaks and capes for miniatures, or on their boots, just making it look like it's mud, dirt, grime splattering up. They've been through, muddy wastelands, things like that. So you can use this technique as little or as much as you want. But I constantly rotate the model around to make sure I'm not overdoing it, because you can quickly overdo the effect. Here I'm using another color I mixed, bone, which is the light umber and ivory. ProAcryl paints, about a 1-to-1 mix in another bottle. This is just much lighter. It's a nice bone color. It's not as bright as the ivory, but just doing the same thing, just in select areas. I'm using the edge of the brush as well as the front, just to catch the edges and add some highlights to it. And there we are. It's looking really good. I'm really pleased with the look of it. Nice beat up and weather worn. Clean up brush there. I put a wash over all the black tires, and now I'm going to use Citadel's contrast paint Wildwood, which is a very dark brown, and I'm going to mix it into the Adrat's Earthshade and Athenian Camo Shade, just for it to get a nice dark washed color. And here, wiping off the excess on my thumb, I'm just applying in the deep dark recesses, just to give it better contrast. And some from, just reclaiming those dark shadows, and now I'm using the second brush to blend out this paint to give it that nice fade from shadow out. So just slightly damp going in and catching the edge of the paint where there's that line, and just moving the brush back and forth and pulling it away to smooth it out and give it that nice blend. This is an advanced technique, and you don't have to do this, but it's a nice effect. We're painting this up to high quality. So you can take your model from whatever level you want to do, how much detail you want to add to it. Now we're going to start adding some highlights to the red after all that weathering. So going back to our highlight color of burnt red and shadow flash, do the mix up here on the wet palette. Almost like a coral looking color. We're going to add some tan flesh into it. And here I kind of go back and forth until I get a color I like. Here I added a bit too much tan flesh, so it's too pale. So just add a little bit of red into it just to darken it. If it's too bright, you add your darker color. If it's too light, if it's too dark, you add your lighter color. And here I'm doing the technique called stippling. It's another, it's the same as with that stippling brush where I was jabbing it onto the model, but here I'm taking a fine tip brush and just adding little dots and dashes to add texture and make it look like the paint is chipped and is damaged and everything. So I'm just concentrating this more on the edges. So just little dash marks. We have that area has the silver metal frame underneath exposed. So I'm bringing the highlight of this color to the edge and underneath, and having a dark color in between the two areas from the bright highlight to the silver to give it that depth, and it looks that 3D effect. So just a little dabbing here and there. So it just looks like the paint is chipped and is coming off. It can be a slow and tedious process, but the finished is so rewarding. And once you get the hang of it, get in the zone of painting, it just goes by really fast. It really adds that next level to the paint job. You want to make sure that the paint is flowing well off your brush and you have a nice point. I keep rotating the model around to see, under the light, to see where my highlights will be. Getting it underneath the oil tank on the edges of the bumper, the back bumper. And around that backlight. So just little dots, just dabbing it on there, little dots and dashes, little lines on the edges. This is also another great technique for doing textured leather, like on cloaks and clothing, things like that. Same thing I did with the satchel bag. So just random splotchiness. That's basically what it is. And I'm keeping it more towards the upper portion of the panels and on the edges with this color, because it's my highlight color. And you can do the opposite, where with a darker color in the shadows and doing the same dots and dashes in the shadows to give it that texture too. So I'm using the tip of the brush and also the side of it just to get, just little lines and little dashes. Adding a little bit more tan flesh into my mitts for the next highlight. And I got a bit too bright, so I just added some more of my burnt red to it. Kind of going back and forth so I get a nice tone that I'm looking for. That it's bright enough but not too bright. So when you're mixing color, it's an art form. So here I'm just doing the same technique but further up on the areas in a smaller portion, building up to that point of that pyramid type thing. And it's thin enough with, just a little bit of water just thins it just right to where I have nice flow off the brush. You don't really want to use a small brush tip. I find the number 1 and even a number 2 is a good size because you have enough belly of the brush to hold the paint. If you use too small of a brush, you have to keep cleaning your brush and getting more paint. This way, having a bigger body on the brush tip is more of a reservoir that keeps your paint wet longer on your brush. So there's the difference between this highlight to how it looked before. And it's a little more of a salmon kind of color, but that works really well on the edges and the brighter, it gives you a brighter highlight. You always want to push the contrast between your highlights and your shadows, darker shadows to a brighter highlight. And it gives you the contrast and makes it pop more. Yeah, this is a very fun technique to do, and just take your time going around the model. And the areas right here on the side paneling where it's got the metal exposed, I just add this highlight between the metal. There's like a dark brown line in between to give it that shadow, so it looks like it's three-dimensional and the paint's actually chipped away from it. It gives you that illusion that the paint has chipped away. And like I said, I really went to town on this chipping and weathering technique on this model. I brought it way up to make it look weather worn and beaten, and just, it's been in the climate very long. All this red paint's chipping off and sandblasted. Once again, Google can be your friend doing picture searches on sandblasted paint jobs and things like that. So just keep adding more highlights. You can brighten it up, you know, with adding more tan flesh on the very edges if you want. It's your model, you can make it however you want. And make sure I got it inside the turret there. Looking really good. I rotate it around to see from different angles if I need to add more highlights or shadows, like I said before. And at one point you need just to say, okay, that's good enough, it's fine, and set it down. So now I'm going to add some texture to some more highlights to the undercarriage with all the dirt. So I'm adding some pale yellow to my dark khaki color on my palette here to get a nice mid-tone. And just doing the same thing but here with the brush, just getting some fine splotching and detail of the dirt. Same thing like I was saying with the highlights and doing it into the shadow, doing the same technique into the shadow. Here I'm just adding it onto the undercarriage so it matches with the highlights of the topper portion. I'm making the dirt and everything the same. Working my way around the model. I'm just concentrating this on the very edges because it's such a bright color. But it really adds that realism to the model. Little dashes and dots. Makes it look so much more lifelike than just adding straight highlight lines. Alright, and there's that layer. I'm not going to go, I don't think I'm going to go any further highlighting with that. Here I'm just doing the same type of technique and just re-establishing some of the rust with that burnt orange. And now with the brighter highlight of orange, plain orange, just a bright orange to give it that highlight of rust. Making all the areas have this texture helps make it a cohesive piece. Working around the gas tank or gas reserve. So just a little dabbing around, working around it. Alright, that's it for all the stippling detail work. So we're going to just add the highlight of the silver again. And this I'm just doing the same technique, the stippling with the brush on the very edges to make it look like the rust has chipped off. Bringing it all the areas up to the brightest highlights and the finest detail. Here, just kind of dragging it across certain areas. And there we go. It's looking really good. Really like how it looks. So now just for some, once again going back to adding some dark shadows. Very thin of the Wildwood, Agrat's Earthshade, and Camo Shade. And just dabbing this onto the bottom mainly of the undercarriage. And then the deep shadows. Just to help define those shadows. Once you add more highlights, the shadow might need to be darker for that contrast. So it's a lot with the painting process. It's a lot of back and forth. You build up your highlights and it might be too bright, so you need to darken your shadows, or you might darken your shadows too much and you need to build up your highlights. So it's a lot of back and forth. And rotating the model around, looking under lamps to see where it needs more highlights or more shadows. So I'm just dabbing this color into all the recesses, and from that it doesn't give me any of those harsh lines. It kind of blends it in there. And it helps bring it all together. It helps smooth out the stippling highlights that I was doing. Alright, so it's looking really good. A few more quick areas there. So now I painted the metal on the wheels, same as before, over a black undercoat, dry brushing dark silver, and then adding the rust technique and then some shade washes. Here on the tires, I have a black undercoat and I'm using blue black from ProAcryl and just dry brushing it onto the tire texture. And now I'm just using some pale gray blue which is very bright, but it brings out the highlights. And I'll be darkening this down with the shading. So just concentrating more on the edges and the upper portion of it. And here I'm just adding my dirt and grime like I did on the undercarriage to all the bottom portion of the wheels. And adding some more in, just to kind of blend it all together. Adding some bright highlight with the yellow ochre. And pale yellow. So just randomly dabbing it on there. Blending it all together so the whole piece looks like it's been through the desert and is all dirty and grimy. Now for the final highlights, it's pale yellow. Making sure I barely have any on the brush, just dabbing it on there. Just adding some more to it. Working it all together, blending it all together. So even though I was concentrating mainly on the wheels, I'm adding more into the undercarriage. Now here we're going to paint the lights. So we're going to use another color I made myself, dark turquoise, which is the ProAcryl colors Jade and dark gray blue. And then as a highlight, we're going to just use turquoise. So these are for the lights on the front. So I mix up my dark turquoise, put that on my palette. So the base coat is black. Here I'm applying turquoise to my palette. You can see the difference between the two. The turquoise is very bright. Get a nice brush with a nice fine tip. So we're going to use black to blacken out the light. And then we have these other little lights up in front, and make sure we get the one in the back. And then once this is dry, we're painting in the lower corner with our dark turquoise. It's kind of hard to see with the gun right there, but I'm just getting the lower right portion of the screen. So just a thin line in the lower corner, the corner edge. So when you're painting lenses or lights, it's basically flipped, where your darkest color is at the top and your brightest is at the bottom. Here I'm adding a highlight of the turquoise. So just another very thin line in the bottom portion, making sure that I didn't paint over the dark turquoise. And here I added a little bit of ivory into my turquoise for a final bright point of the color. So this is mainly just a dot in the bottom corner of it. And now I'm using ivory and just painting at the opposite top portion of my color, just a thin line or a dot, just to give it that reflectiveness, to make it look like it's a lens. You'll see this better when in the finished pictures. So here's kind of a close-up of it. And that's the completion of the model. And I did the same techniques, but just with different, same basic colors and techniques with the green one. I didn't add too much with the paint chipping on that one, just so for a difference, but it still looks great. And here is the completed pictures. You can see the lenses. I did a red lens on the green to give it nice contrast to the turquoise. All that dirt and grime. After I was finished, I did another layer of matte varnish to seal it in. Here's the top of the red, and here's the green tank. These were so much fun to paint, and I want to thank Seedy Tea Publishing for giving me the chance to paint these up and do a video on it. Thank you so much for watching.